Video games started out as you controlling little amorphous squares around a screen where half the time you didn't even know what you were meant to be controlling. Half of the novelty of this era of gaming was being able to control something on your TV. It was something they'd never seen before.
You could get a game where the artwork looked like this, but then when you got it home it was just a mess of pixels fighting over a nuclear waterfall.
Brother,
And in this era you couldn't really have an art style for your video game because the technology at the time was so basic it didn't really allow for it. Then enter the NES and Master System generations where the graphics got better and we got a whole 8 bits.
Whatever that meant. We didn't know back then and we still don't know now. All we know is it meant the graphics are better, innit? I mean, I'm old, but I'm not that old.
And this hardware meant you could actually understand what it was you were looking at without having to have a, imagination. I get that there's a sort of primitive charm to these graphics, and I'm always a fan of art that tries to work within limitations.
But if I didn't tell you that the game you were just looking at is a He-Man game, would you have been able to tell me?
Looks like a Star Wars land speeder game for swear word I can't say on YouTube's sake.
What was I talking about again? Oh yeah, video game graphics, urban youth pointing at head.gif.
While the options for defined art styles during this era were a bit more varied, you still ended up with a lot of games looking very similar. In this era it was more about the setting and the theme of your game giving it the art style than an actual codified vision. You could get stuff that looked like Castlevania or Ghouls and Ghosts with their gothic themes, or you could get cutesy cartoony stuff like Kirby and Mario. But you really started to see a renaissance of people starting to try different things with the presentation of games when the 16-bit generation rolled around.
And this was the stuff I was actually around for. The SNES was released the year I was born in the UK. Soon I will be but Fred Durst in the wind.
I'll never forget the first time I laid eyes on a video game, and it just so happened to be Super Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo.
I actually played it around a neighbour's house for the first time, and then I begged my parents for my very own SNES. And that's why I'm the fat loser I am today.
Might as well have just put me down there and then as preemptive punishment for what I would later go on to say in Call of Duty voice chat in the 360 era. In the 16-bit era, they tried to get all they could out of the SNES and Megadrive consoles, trying to push the boundaries of what you could do within gaming. You have your beautiful, cartoony, colourful graphics that you'd get from the likes of Sonic and Mario. But you also had stuff like Another World, which came out on both consoles and just has to be one of the most interesting looking games from this era. It almost had a 3D look to it with its blend of vector graphics and bits of rotoscoping to give it its signature look. And of course, both consoles would try their hands at early 3D games with stuff like Star Fox and Hard Driving, which were revolutionary for the time.
But yeah, they're a bit ugly. I would have used the Muslim preacher meme again if I hadn't blew my load so early in the video. I'm always doing that. What? I don't get to touch a woman very often.
And the use of Mode 7 on the SNES did give certain games a really unique look, like Hero Pilot Wings or on a lot of the driving games where it had a really defined style to it.
I kinda wish this style would make a comeback in modern retro games. It would look really rad.
But a game that uses it a lot is Super Mario World 2, Yoshi's Island, and incidentally this is another game that just tried something wild and stark with its art style choices, and a thing that was not possible on 8-bit hardware. The coolest use of it for me is this level in Super Castlevania 4 where the whole level is spinning around you as you play it. And it was also used in another spooky game and one of my favourite SNES games, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, on this spinning level.
A video on that game is coming very soon.
One of the weirdest art style choices in a game on both consoles has to be Clay Fighter, which is a childhood favourite of mine. Right, so you take Street Fighter, which I already loved, and then you add in monsters that look like they stepped out of Arbon Studios into it.
And it might be my nostalgia talking a little bit here, but this game kinda holds up.
I mean, it's not the best game ever, but the art style and zany nature of it just pulls it through, and it's a good early example of a game that's completely based around its art style. In a similar vein you have Plock, which is another one of my childhood favourites and is one of the few good games to be made in my country. We have a saying here.
God bless the king, and of course, Plock 2.
Yes, I paid £12 for the Ugandan wrestler Lord White to say that. He actually roasted me after this because I assumed he wouldn't know what Plock was.
But then I read further in your instructions, and in brackets shortly after you were like, Plock is a video game developed for the SNES. I'll have you know, sharp-dressed goblin, that I am the greatest gamer in all of Uganda, and of course I know what bloody Plock is.
That is without a doubt the best £12 I've ever spent. All hail Lord White.
Anyway, the French would later rip this character off with his arm shooting antics and pervert him into Rayman that just reeks of baguettes and garlic.
You don't want to be like this. This is disgusting.
And I can't mention English game studios without mentioning the best there ever was and the best there ever will be, Rare.
The next time an American says, "Ooh, you lot like beans and I wish the UK was blown up." I mean, I'm not exactly helping the stereotype, am I? But I'll say, I wish the UK was blown up as well, but we did make Rare.
Not only did they make one of the best SNES games of all time, Donkey Kong Country, they also produced the game with one of the most interesting art styles. using pre-rendered 3D graphics that were turned into SNES graphics through compression, which gave it its signature look that blew us all away in the 90s. And using this technique, they also managed to make one of the best fighting games of all time that, in my opinion, sprays "I'm the Scatman bleep bad at bow" all over Mortal Kombat.
Okay, I'm probably giving way too much love to the SNES, so let's talk about a couple games on the Megadrive or the Genesis for the Yanks. My mind has been so poisoned by American retro video game YouTubers that I do sometimes say Genesis, which is a crime punishable by death in the UK, so I should be more careful. But come on, the Megadrive is a far superior name. It sounds like a wrestler's finishing move or something. And then you've got the Genesis. Is it a games console or a bloody Bible?
The first game that jumps to mind when it comes to art styles and games that really kick you in the pants and leave an impression is Streets of Rage. And it causes me physical pain to talk about this game without mentioning the GOAT that is Yuzo Koshiro, who did the soundtrack.
But there you go, I mentioned him.
This was one of the first games I had with my Mega Drive growing up, and this opening with its beautiful visuals and glorious music packed a powerful 1-2 punch. I've often toyed with the idea of getting this skyline tattooed on me somewhere. This game has such a strong sense of style, everything is just so clean, and even though it's not a cyberpunk game, it has that vibe for whatever reason. It feels like they were trying to summon the spirit of every cool 80s sci-fi action movie you could think of. But then of course on the weirder side you have Vector Man, which was actually a response to what Nintendo was doing with the likes of Donkey Kong Country. And you can really tell that when you look at this game because it looks very similar. But that's not to say that this game doesn't have its own charms, because this game, as the literal flesh demon James Blunt would say, is beautiful. It's true. I mean, just look at this first level with the lovely, almost parallax scrolling background accented with these semi-3D constructions. And this game was a very late release on the system, releasing in 1995, and you can tell because they were really milking the hardware for all it's worth here. They kind of showed here how pointless the release of the 32X was when this game looks just as good as about half the stuff that was released on that ill-fated add-on.
But I've also got to mention that Vector Man is a really good game apart from having its somewhat unique art style, even if it's heavily aping Donkey Kong Country. I was going to say something about my genius wordplay there, but you, yes you, handsome viewer, knew exactly what I meant immediately. And yes, I said handsome because there ain't no women watching this. And if there is, I mean, you can be handsome as well, why not?
Another Mega Drive game that I won't shut up about and doesn't get the love it deserves is Bonanza Brothers, which is, of course, another childhood favourite of mine. I mean, the concept for this game itself is unique enough at the time. You play a robber who's trying to do some industrial pillaging from big companies to get rich.
Based.
It's a Wario-like premise, so I'm already on board, but it plays so differently than its contemporaries, with it almost being a stealth game. I know we're here to talk about graphics, but just one more thing that makes this game infinitely more replayable for me is the fact that it's co-op. Me and my friends, Robin the Hood. The game has this almost papercraft look to it, with everything being very stark and defined, but the characters having this weird banana people look to them. Maybe I just liked this style as a kid because it reminded me of Bananas in Pyjamas, which was a show I was obsessed with as a kid.
Yes, there really was a show where anthropomorphic bananas went around in pyjamas all day for some reason. Listen here, banana boys, if you're gonna go outside, have the decency to put some damn clothes on. Don't be like those chavvy mums that go out in their slippers at like 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Just have some propriety, that's all I'm asking.
And before we move on, I should probably mention the CD add-on for the Mega Drive and Genesis called the Mega CD and the Sega CD respectively. Because in many ways this failed stopgap between the generations was the perfect envoy of what was going to come in the next generation's consoles. Angry video game nerds summed it up perfectly back in the day.
So this is the Sega CD. It's a load of ass.
Sega were a bit too early to the party with this one, like there were so many times in their history as a company. Because of course they were correct about the CD being the way forward, it was easier to produce than a cartridge and it could hold more data. But it's all in the execution, and half of the stuff on this add-on was stuff you could already do on a Mega Drive, or stuff that basically was 50p video that looked like it'd been shoved up a dog's butthole before being put on the screen. Of course they did do some interesting things with this, like the groundbreaking FMV video game Night Trap that actually caused a lot of controversy back in the day. It was one of the games that led to the court hearings over video game violence back in the day and was part of the reason we got a rating system on games.
So that years later, I would have to go get older kids to buy me a copy of Grand Theft Auto for a blowy behind the bins. I mean, I kept giving people blowies behind the bins, but that was by choice.
Of course, there was also whole consoles that were basically FMV game machines with the release of the Panasonic 3DO and the Phillips CD-i. The 3DO had the masterpiece that was Plumbers Don't Wear Ties, which was basically softcore corn.
If you got that reference, you're either A, as old as LimeWire, or B, were abused by your parents. Am I really gonna keep that line in the effing video?
Yes.
So yeah, Plumbers Don't Wear Ties is practically a softcore corn slideshow with occasional bits of risque videos and choices thrown in to make it barely meet the classification of a video game. I mean, I guess it's an art style and one hell of a bold stylistic choice. It's avant-garde, it's Michelangelo from Ninja Turtles, Bob Ross.
Africa, Russia, and finally, ach du Scheiße!
And while we're talking about these weird in-between points, I think we should bring up the weird oddities that are the 2 Zelda games released on the Phillips CD-i. I mean, most of you probably already know this, but Philips and Nintendo were working together on a CD add-on for the SNES that never came to be. And because of this contract, they had allowed Philips to use some Nintendo IP on the real fated console, and these games could be a video all in themselves. But look at the absolutely horrifying art style these games had. It's like they let Meat Canyon have his own Zelda game. And don't even get me started on the absolute cancer that is the Mario game for this console, Hotel Mario.
I'm convinced that some outsider artist type made the concepts for these games in his own Green Day Dookie.png. That was a JPEG, not a PNG. Silly goblin.
After this weird transitional period, we would finally get the consoles that matter for the purposes of this video, the PS1, the Sega Saturn, and the N64. This is where things in terms of art style really started to heat up because you now had polygons and 3 whole dimensions to work with. Just like real life. And these things combined with the new CD technology led to creatives doing wacky and wild things with a medium of video games. But this is also where the problem that is at the heart of me making this video got its beginnings.
Now, it's not really a problem at this point, but it will become one later in our story.
And this problem was the fact that now we could make games fully in the 3rd dimension when we had better graphics, which meant people tried their hands at realism. When you're talking about realism in this era, it looks pretty bad because the technology just wasn't there yet. And drawing the line between art style and realism in this generation was quite a hard thing to do, and this 32-bit style realism has become an art style in its own right. The point I'm going to be making with this era that follows through into the later gens is that any game where it's going for out and out realism ages like milk. And for a few examples of this, I would bring up the military games of Siphon Filter and Medal of Honor, which seemingly just gun for a more realistic feel in 2 different perspectives, 1st and 3rd person, which is more of a thing now in this gen. But because they've not gone for a more defined art style, they don't hold up as well as something that's gone for something more specific with its art style. Like for example Crash Bandicoot with its very cartoony and big style that honestly still looks great to this day because of that. Or on the other side of the spectrum you've got Medieval, which kinda has that more dark and gritty cartoon style with it feeling like if Tim Burton made a platformer. Looking at these games back to back, you're more than likely going to want to play the more appealing games that have a defined style to them that makes them more memorable. And this goes for a lot of the more realism based stuff in this gen, like the sports games of this era that's just too rough. You never really hear people saying they want to go back to the sports games of this era other than just pure nostalgia. But when it comes to 2D sports games, they're just a lot more timeless. I mean, Blades of Steel is as old as Father Time, but I still go back to play it because it rules.
We'll get into this a little bit later in the video when it starts to become a bit more stark and talk about why it's such a problem in the modern day. Because right now I want to talk about some of the awesome art styles and trends that were going on in this gen because there's a lot of good stuff.
And I don't think I'm being biased when I say the console that was on the forefront of most of this innovation was the PlayStation 1. It was my first console from this era and it had won over its 2 competitors, the Saturn and the N64. First, the Saturn was a little bit weaker in terms of 3D capabilities and was said to be harder to get the most out of for developers because it was overly complex. But that's not to say the Saturn didn't have its points though, because in many ways it's the ultimate 2D machine and we'll bring a couple of examples of that up later. And second, you had the N64, which was released way later than the PlayStation 1 and was hampered by Nintendo choosing to go with a cartridge-based system again.
And it had this controller, which I think might have been made for aliens.
Or maybe Goro or Vishnu could get something out of this abomination against mankind's hands. The PlayStation just came along and did what these 2 old boys of the industry couldn't do with their new hardware. I'll never forget the first time I played a PS1. My older sister actually got one first and she brought it over to the family home to show it off to everyone. And my sister died a few short years after this, which kind of makes this memory a bit bittersweet, but I can't look at a PS1 without thinking about her. At this point she didn't even actually have any games for it and she was just bringing it round so we could all play a demo that she had for it. And it was the first time we all heard that heavenly noise. After that, I got to play my first 3D game of a Crash Bandicoot demo that got me hooked immediately and made me beg my parents for my own PS1. Crash Bandicoot in many ways is a perfect game to bring up first here because it's a game itself stuck between eras. With it essentially being what if you brought Donkey Kong Country forward into the 3D era, fully utilising the fact that it's in 3D though. I mean, you had levels behind Crash, you had levels where it was very much side on like Mario, and even levels where he was running towards the camera. Which might not sound like much now, but it had us all Keanu Reevesing. That doesn't sound like a verb, but the goblin says so, so now it is a verb. You're playing Monopoly and I'm tipping the board over because I hate you. However, Crash having this balance between 2D and 3D gameplay and graphics would be a thing that happened a lot in this era. You have games like Road Rash that kind of blend the use of 2D and 3D into its very own art style. One of the most beautiful examples of this has to be Klonoa, and it holds up in the visuals department. With these sprite-based looking characters juxtaposed against these polygon backgrounds, it just gives the game its unique look and charm. Or you get it in games like Pandemonium, which was one of the first games owned on my PS1, which is just a fully polygonal version of a 2D platformer. And I would get lynched in the comments if I was talking about these style of games and didn't mention Tomba, which is kind of a mix of these two approaches I just mentioned.
And for some reason it's called Tombi here.
It's like if Donkey Kong Country had access to polygons for the backgrounds, and it just stands out much like Klonoa. This was one of the games I remember renting from a local library quite a lot back in the day, and I'm considering maybe selling one of my kidneys so I can afford a physical copy of it. Seriously, 200 quid for a PS1 game. I think I'll take the money and go get pissed with the lads and watch the footy and get a few lines of Tipex, if you know what I'm saying, sunshine. But another thing this console was well known for that became one of its signatures was the use of pre-rendered backgrounds that appeared in a lot of JRPGs and survival horror games. Sure, these methods were a bit primitive, but looking back on them now in some games, they do look really good and timeless. It's an art style in itself, and every time I go back to Final Fantasy IX, I can't help but marvel at how good it still looks. One of my favourite uses of pre-rendered backgrounds has to be in one of my favourite PS1 games of all time, Digimon World. Got a whole video on that series, winking fat Englishman.mp4. For me, this is the most magic use of this technique because it's basically in an open world game that you can explore at your leisure. And this mix of polygons and pre-rendered backgrounds gives this game its special charm, and is probably why I like coming back to this game again and again. It makes the whole game an absolute joy to adventure around, and it kinda helps envelop you in its chill atmosphere. Another big marker of this gem for me was the use of CG cutscenes being chucked into games because they have the disc technology now and they've got to fill that disc up somehow. I like to fill my PS1 games with beans personally. And these haven't aged so well compared to the other things. Like this infamous scene from Digimon World 1 where the main character looks like a demon that's hollowed out a small Japanese child and is using him as a skin puppet. I hate to use the same games again, but the ones in Final Fantasy IX do look absolutely fantastic though, and that's probably because it's a late release PS1 game. And these are a few things that are PS1 staples, but with this new technology it did lead to a lot of artists making really interesting graphical styles for games that stand on their own in the library. One of the first games that comes to mind when you mention unique looking PS1 games is probably Parappa the Rapper. This is one of the most iconic games from the early life of the PlayStation 1, and it seemed like everyone had this one. With its art style where all the characters almost look like they were bouncing around in a pop-up book or something, which just married so perfectly with the quirky nature of it being a rap-based rhythm game that even a dirty white boy like me could get behind.
Actually, I can't get behind this game because it's like the Dark Souls of rhythm games.
A game that took a completely different approach was the Neverhood that went for what Clayfighter was trying to do, but better in many ways. Because of the advances in technology, these guys could actually create all these areas physically with real clay and then put it into a playable video game. And as a kid who grew up watching stuff like Trapdoor, Morph, Pingu, and of course Wallace and Gromit, games like this one were a dream come true. When you look at the behind the scenes footage for this game, you can see what a grand undertaking and a labour of love it was for them to make this game. And when you play it, you can feel the craft that went into this quirky little game. Only problem for me though is, this is a point and click game and I hate most of these because of my disability. Puzzleophobia.
And the fact that the puzzles are always like, trade this pineapple for a hand grenade, and then shove the hand grenade up a shark's asshole, and then your mum will bring you a blueberry muffin with the key you need to get through a door. I have a history with this genre.
But they use the same techniques they used in the Neverhood for a game that's way more up my alley, Skull Monkeys, a claymation platformer. And this game even now is gorgeous to look at and a PS1 game I really like. Even if it's as difficult as trying to make me leave my secret goblin goon cave. And for me, the game with the strongest art style on the whole of the PS1 has to be the Japan-only classic LSD Dream emulator, which I've already done a full video on, cough cough cough. This having a really good art style isn't surprising considering that it was a game made by the mad artist Osamu Sato, who treated this project as a digital art installation rather than an actual video game. And I don't think there's any PS1 game that quite has the look and feel of this game. It's insane, it's like you're adventuring through an acid trip or something. Now, I would be absolutely pilloried in the comments if I didn't at some point in the PS1 section mention Fear Effect, which is a game I've never played. But it is an important game art style wise because it's the first game by all accounts to attempt the cel shaded look, which will definitely be coming up later. Technically it's not actually cel shaded, but through some techno babble they managed to emulate this look with the PS1 hardware. It's ahead of its time in that regard, and it gives this game a very interesting look that kind of feels like a graphic novel come to life.
And I kind of want to play it now, it looks really cool.
Okay, we might be over-filleting the PS1 a bit here, even though for me it did have the most interesting stuff art style wise in this era, but the other consoles do have some stuff worth talking about in this video. While I never owned a Sega Saturn back in the day, my sister did, and whenever I used to stay over her house for the weekend, we'd play it. While the Sega Saturn in the 3D realm wasn't quite as clean as the PS1, it certainly did have its own Sega arcade games light style to it. Like for example the groundbreaking fighter Virtua Fighter, which in the arcade pioneered 3D fighting games but here looks a bit rough. Obviously the Saturn was a little bit earlier than the PS1, but this is the hallmark of 3D graphics on this system. A lot of the time they're extra blocky compared to the PS1. One area that I think this style works in its favour though is with the racing games, and oh boy does this console have some great racing games. To be fair, most of the ones like Sega Rally and Daytona are ones that I have a lot of memories of playing with my dad in the arcade though. However, here they don't look so hot, but they do have a bit of swagger about them if you ignore the pretty bad popping. The game on the system I have the most nostalgia and experience with happens to be one with a strong art style, and that is Clockwork Knight. I can't play this game without thinking about my sister, and it's just a feast for the eyes with this similar feel to Klonoa and Tomba. What sets this one apart for me though is the setting of playing through these levels as a little toy going through these playset looking backgrounds. I always love games where you're playing as something little in a normal everyday environment like Micro Machines or Micromaniacs. Guardian Heroes though I think sums up what the Saturn is good at with its mix of beautiful 2D capabilities of the console and this 3D stuff in the background. Apart from this being an amazing game to play, it's also got a very distinctive look to it that you could only get on this console. And the game that perfectly and starkly shows the advantage of the Saturn when it comes to 2D games is Marvel vs. Capcom. This version completely wrecks the PS1 version and is seen as about as close to the arcade version as you can get on a console from the time. But before we move on, we better talk about the N64 a bit and some of the games that have good and memorable art styles on that console. The most obvious choice being Paper Mario with its look that kind of apes what Parappa the Rapper was trying to do. Except for here they go all in with the theme of everything being made of paper, and it's a world that you can actually explore a bit unlike Parappa. And as a kid this was one of my first RPGs that I actually got that wasn't Pokemon. I think the way they wrap the art style into the gameplay is really well done and it's probably one of my favourite N64 games.
Which is also incredibly expensive to buy. Thank Lemmy for emulation. And yes, I said Lemmy instead of God because he is God. Look, there he is, as the son of God, but he is actually God.
And there's actually another N64 game that has a very similar art style but uses it in a different genre. The game is called Rakuga Kids and it's a really good fighting game made by Konami that I never hear anyone mention. Probably because it didn't get released in America and 90% of retro video game YouTubers are American.
I don't understand a word you just said. Try speaking American, it's the only language I understand.
Too busy being £900 and assaulting people at Walmart for discounted pizza rolls. What, you think you're better than me because I eat beans and my teeth are bad?
It's okay, baby. I won't let them shoot you with an AR-15.
It's less Paper Mario and going for more of a style like it was a fight being doodled by a talented child and transposed onto a gorgeous 3D environment. And there's nothing quite like it in this generation of consoles, and it's a really good game that more Yankee Doodle Bandit Keith Cheeseburger with a side of freedom fries should really be playing.
I wrote that in the script with no spaces.
I would probably get a load of angry comments if I didn't in this N64 section mention Yoshi's Story, which was another game I used to rent from the local public library quite a lot, and it is a game I have a lot of fond memories of. And much like its predecessor Yoshi's Island, it goes for a very bold art style that's kind of like a mix of a lot of games we've been talking about. The characters have this smooth, cartoony 2D polygon look to them like Tomba or Klonoa, and the backgrounds have this Paper Mario-esque handcrafted look to them that makes any Italian chef give the chef power sign in respect when he sees it. Similarly, another game I love that pulls this style off the best on the console for me is Kirby 64 The Crystal Shards, which has got to be one of the most clean looking platformers on the N64, but it's still looking pretty great now through style alone. I'll give a little shout out here to Mischief Makers and Mystical Ninja 2, which do the same thing these games are doing.
Mystical Ninja 2 is a banger, but we must move on now because my ADHD commands it.
Now the next generation of consoles is where things would really hot up in terms of power creators had to work with, and this would lead to what I would argue would be the most interesting and beautiful art styles that still stand the test of time. Of course the Dreamcast is the first one in Endure and is kind of a console stuck between generations. I was getting ready to completely write this console off to save time and annoy its fans so I can milk them like an aging cow for YouTube comment interactions to help me in the algorithm.
But I wouldn't do that because us here at Sharp Dress Goblin LLC get our interaction milk sustainably from giant spider titties.
In my mind I was going I should just skip the Dreamcast because I can't think of any games that have good or interesting art styles on that console. Then I remembered. Jet Set Radio, innit? I never actually owned a Dreamcast as a kid, but my brother did have one and this is a game I played at his house quite a lot. As a fan of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, or literally just Tony Hawk's skateboarding in the UK for whatever reason, God, we deserve to be sunk into the sea like Atlantis. Child me was up for an extreme sports game with a great soundtrack and a style that looked like you were playing a cartoon. If Fear Effect was the ugly duckling, Jet Set Radio was the ugly duckling, all grown up, now a handsome Nigel Thornberry looking man just like me. This game has got to be the point where people started seeing the merits of using cell shading in video games. And it undoubtedly left an impact on a lot of people who would now go on to use this style to a greater effect in the coming generation. Now, I'm not saying the Dreamcast is bad here, what I'm saying is it didn't really have many games that had a defined style to it. But what it did have in spades is the classic Sega arcade art style to it in games like Crazy Taxi, House of the Dead, Sonic Adventure and Shenmue. And there's something to be said for this art style, a lot of these games still look great. One of my favourite that I just wanted an excuse to mention was Skies of Arcadia, which sort of has that staple Sega arcade look to it. I mean, I played this for the first time on the Gamecube, but here it still looks amazing.
And that's about it for the Dreamcast. Tell me all the games I missed in the comments.
The Dreamcast did make a pretty big impact when it came out, but it was just eclipsed when the PS2 came out to cast its massive boober shadow. And as we all know, it did so well because it was a DVD player and a games console, so a lot of us people bought it for a DVD player that also kept the kids quiet. Many of you will remember the pains of playing pirated DVDs on them and then playing in black and white for some reason. Whenever I watch Napoleon Dynamite to this day, I forget that it's not actually in black and white. My stepdad used to buy fake DVDs off a dodgy bloke at a market every Saturday. It was normal back then. But calling it a glorified DVD player is harsh because the PS2 got cake. And I mean, oh lord, he come in levels of cake. But when the PS2 and its contemporaries, the Gamecube and the Xbox, started releasing, this is where the problem that made me want to start writing this video started. With the jump in graphical fidelity, it seemed like every game, rightly so at this point in history, wanted to just shoot for out and out realism. Because, you know, they could actually do that now. Well, realism in terms of the times and not now, of course. While I would argue it wasn't that much of a rampant problem at this point, it will become one later. But take this example for what I'm talking about. Let's go to the world of sports games to make this point. Look at FIFA 2003, a game for my sins I played a lot of as a kid, and because it's going for realism, it looks absolutely awful and doesn't hold up whatsoever. Let's take a look at a similar sports game called Sega Soccer Slam that instead of realism goes for a solid cartoony art style. It obviously holds up a whole lot better than FIFA 2003.
I have more to say about this as we track through the years, but I just wanted to bring it up here as a developing issue.
I think for the most part here in this generation though, it was quite an isolated thing and we still got buckets of games that actually tried something different. If you ask anyone what's a game from the 360 era backwards that you think of first when I mention games with an interesting art style, the answers are always going to be Okami. And I tested this out on Twitter, as you can see, these are the results. I forgot for a second that I'm not a real YouTuber that people actually care about. And most people didn't say Okami, but I'm sure more people would have if, you know, people actually watched me. They should have all said Okami because it is both an amazing game and one with a gorgeous, almost indulgent art style. It takes what Fear Effect and Jet Set Radio were trying to do and just turns it up to 11. This is a game when it's ported over to modern resolutions looks like a game that could have been released today. And I mean hell, it's pretty close when you're looking at it on a PS2. And it's a shining example of what I'm going to be elaborating on more later in this video. In many ways, this whole generation was a renaissance for art styles in games, and this cel-shaded look in particular. So many games attempted this look to varying degrees of success, but it always is at the very least interesting to look at. You've got games like Cell Damage, which was a very early game to the party and manages to look like an old school Hanna-Barbera cartoon come to life. Or 13, which is this slick James Bond-like FPS that looks like the realisation of what Fear Effect was trying to do with its graphic novel come to life look. And again, because the art style is so strong, it's aged like a fine wine, and when upscaled a bit for modern TVs, it looks slick as hell. And Capcom more than any other would use this style a lot in this era because Okami isn't the only time they do it. Stuff like Killer 7 and Beautiful Joe would take this style and do something different with them. Beautiful Joe being one of my favourites because it's just such a great fun little platformer. And Joe is just a ginger version of the philosopher and artist of our times, Fred Durst, and that's just incredibly based and I don't know what to tell you.
Did you know that the chocolate starfish and the hot dog flavoured water is Bumholes and Seaman for the Dreamcast?
However, Nintendo would probably take the award in terms of the best use of cel shading in a game from this time with the absolute classic and my second favourite Zelda, Wind Waker. A game that in many ways took the brunt of the criticism this art style was getting from the absolutely smooth-brained game journalists from the time. I remember the discourse around this game being that Nintendo is completely foolish to be using this childish art style for Zelda instead of going for ultra realism. And I remember this being the first time I realised games journalists are dumb and don't know what the hell they're talking about. Because this game is one of the most fondly remembered Zelda games over a lot of the realism based ones because it has a strong art style. And unlike a lot of the other 3D Zelda games, it stands the test of time again because they went in this direction. And exploring this amazing world that just looks like it stepped off the screen of an animated feature is just magical no matter how many times I play it. But they definitely went a bit mad with the water in this one. 0 out of 10, too much water. I'm a games journalist now. And a game that is actually Capcom again and is adjacent to cel-shaded graphics while being in my opinion completely its own thing is Gregory Horror Show.
I'm a broken record here, but I already have a full video on this, and it is one of my childhood favourites because of course it is.
This game tries to emulate the CG animated Japanese show it's based on, which results in this almost papercrafts looking art style. And it's such a stark look that I wish someone would try again with a newer game. The best thing about this art style is how it clashes with the dark horror themes of this game. A classic that more people need to play, and I think it doesn't get much love because again it wasn't released in the land of the burger. Another game that doesn't get enough love for what it's doing graphically was the Vanillaware classic Odin Sphere. This is a company that thankfully over the years has started getting more love for their beautiful art, and for me they're like a video game Studio Ghibli. And even here on the PS2 with Odin Sphere, their style is here almost fully formed with it looking like you're playing a beautiful painting. And it definitely helps that the action RPG built on these graphics is absolutely amazing. I would say that Nintendo through this whole generation with the Gamecube and going forward would develop this timeless cartoony graphical style. Sure, they did this a lot on the N64, but there it still aged quite poorly because of the graphical fidelity just not being good enough yet. But here on the Gamecube you can take a lot of these games and upscale them and they look nearly as good as something released today. Similar in a way to how the 8-bit and 16-bit stuff doesn't age as poorly as the early 3D stuff does because it's not as realistic looking. My perfect example for this is Luigi's Mansion, which was my first Gamecube game with Smash Bros and Mario Kart Double Dash, and it blew me away. It still blows me away now how good Luigi's Mansion looks today. It looks like you're playing a little 3D animated movie. And that same praise goes for stuff like Double Dash and Super Mario Sunshine. Nintendo were just cooking during the Gamecube era. Disgaea is one game series worth mentioning here with its creative mix of 2D and 3D and the fact that it's a great tactical RPG series. And I thought there would be more interesting games to mention in this section, but I got there and that was most of the ones that came to my mind. I could go on about cel-shaded games some more of course, but there's loads and they're not all as good as the ones I mentioned. Having less limitations on what you can create leads to a lot more people not having to think outside the box like we saw in this generation. Most people went cartoony or realistic, and this problem, as we will see, will only worsen with time and start to, in my opinion, erode the medium of video games. Which leads us to our next generation of games, and this is where the seeds of games not having to try out their art style started to really grow and bear fruit. That's not to say there isn't any games that thought outside of the box, but most of that is thanks to the burgeoning indie space at this time, which we will get into. This was the first generation in which I was old enough to actually choose my own games because I was out of school and I had a job now. No more asking strangers to buy me video games, I could buy my own copy of Dead or Alive Volleyball. And I remember being such a stupid kid back then that when I got my first £1,000 paycheck I went straight to my local game shop and spent the whole thing on games. If I did that now, I would have to move out of my magical goblin goon cave. This generation will always be very nostalgic for me because it felt like we had a wonderland of good games coming out back then. Having this whole new space of the PlayStation Store and the Xbox Live Arcade meant there was always something to play even when you were skint. This generation was a resurgence for 2D games because of little indie teams that could actually make this stuff themselves. And Xbox and Sony were desperate to push and support these guys because they needed stuff to fill these digital storefronts. Which led to a style which was mostly prevalent on free gaming sites like Newgrounds starting to get their way over onto consoles. Games like Super Meat Boy and Castle Crashers brought the flash art style that was developing on these websites and took them to the masses. It was a refreshing sip out of your can of beans. It gave rise to a fun time when we would get these savant indie game creators who were like rockstar filmmakers from back in the day, like Philip Fish and Jonathan Blow with their artsy indie games being gobbled up by the gaming press at the time. And a lot of the stark art styles from this gen comes from that indie space. Bastion is one of the first ones that comes to mind with its isometric take on what Vanillaware was doing in their games almost. Then you have games like Limbo, which is completely black and white and caused quite a splash when it came out. And in a similar vein you had Mad World with its more black and white graphic novel come to life look. For me this looks like the old artwork you'd get in old Warhammer books in the 80s and 90s, it's very John Blanche. But Minecraft, which is arguably the biggest indie game of all time, also happened to have a really unique art style. I remember playing this game with a few friends from a forum back in the day when it was in its free alpha or beta period.
I didn't get it or why anyone would be interested in this kind of thing because I don't have autism.
This cubey style took the look of every childhood construction toy and made it playable for kids and teenagers everywhere. And made the career of hundreds of people that would later go on to predate on children. This indie renaissance led to the big companies licking their big fat chops and seeing potential piles of gold they're missing out on. Ubisoft particularly were getting on this trend, and as an Englishman I don't want to give these French skits praise, but they did a good job in this era. Valiant Hearts really reminds me of the French cartoon Asterix, which is pretty appropriate. But the style definitely clashes with this sad game about the ravages of the Great War, and it's fondly remembered for good reason. Ubisoft also did Rayman Origins and Legends in this era, which both have stunningly painted art styles. And honestly, hats off to them in this era because they were really cooking for me. Rayman Legends is one of the best platformers ever made. That was so difficult to say because they're French. It's actually alright. For me though, one of the best executed games of this era from an art style perspective is the Level 5 and Studio Ghibli collaboration Ni no Kuni. I actually bought a PS3 pretty much so I could play this game because I was perfectly happy with my 360 at the time. The way they did the graphics at times honestly made me feel like I was adventuring around a Studio Ghibli movie, and it had a certain magic to it. This is another one that when it gets re-released with just that resolution bumped up, it is still breathtaking to look at. One that people brought up to me when I mentioned I was making this video was Borderlands. And I can see why they mentioned it. It takes the cel shaded graphics from the last gen and goes a bit further with it. I just don't think about it personally because it's the kind of game where you have to actually play it with people. And I hate people. Now while there was a lot of cool stuff going on in the indies and a few select examples, this generation was awash with a plague. The plague of brown and grey military shooters. And the Patient Zero was of course the fault of the success of the military shooter juggernaut Call of Duty. It seemed like because of the success of this series, every company was wanting a slice of the pie. And even games that weren't online FPS games were adopting its style of bland and realistic graphics. And going forward, we would see people actually putting time and effort into the visual aesthetics of their game becoming less and less of a thing. Moving into the next gen up until now, most games have fallen into three categories: ultra realism, cartoony corporate sludge because of Fortnite's success, and 2D stuff. And it's been like this for a very long time now. Every single game that comes out is going for one of these styles. And that's not to say there isn't interesting art styles, there's still indies pushing the envelope. I mean, look at Harold Halibut for example, that almost looks like a spiritual successor to the Neverhood. But look at the popular releases that are coming out now. As you scroll over any modern storefront, nothing stands out. Not many games excite me anymore in the mainstream, and everything just feels like it's been FIFA-ized. It's throwaway content that will be outdated in a couple of years, and nothing is built to last as an enduring piece of art anymore. We live in a throwaway culture that just consumes content that's meant to be consumed in one sitting and then chucked into a landfill. And you could tell me that this is because video games have become a bigger industry since I was a kid, with hundreds to thousands of people working on projects rather than tens. And you would be right in that regard. Artistic visions are stifled by having too many cooks in the kitchen, and what is produced is mass consumer sludge that appeals to the most people, which is the equivalent to the slop meals from Sims 1. Which is why I was attracted to platforms like YouTube in the first place, rather than playing in bands like I used to. Because on this platform, in many ways, you just get to make whatever you want and go wherever your creativity takes you. The concept of muse and creativity are always fascinating to me, and I always love talking to other creatives about this kind of stuff. It feels like in video games we're not getting enough of these creative mastermind savants who can pull loads of people together to make their vision reality. Everything is by committee, and as the old saying goes, a horse by committee is a camel. Because you have this vision of what you want and then other people get in there and get their input, and then you end up having a camel. It's over-designed, and what you wanted was a slick, streamlined horse.
Maybe we should do everything by committee, because getting rid of horses would get rid of horse girls, who are bloody weird.
I mean, there's still a couple of these guys who are still about like Kojima, but he's an echo of a bygone era. The closest you've got is maybe someone like Neil Druckmann with The Last of Us, but even he made it into a train wreck with The Last of Us 2, which I really want to do a video on soon. Actually, Last of Us 2 is a perfect example of what I'm talking about in terms of the whole debate I was having in my head about art style versus realism. It's why I used that picture from The Last of Us 2 in the thumbnail. And also because this still from the game will never not be funny. Don't get me wrong, The Last of Us 2 on a technical level is a beautiful game, but like many modern games, it has no soul to it. It feels like looking at a nicely painted cream wall. Yeah, they've done a good job with it, but it's still just a cream wall. And in 10 years time, the facial animations will look incredibly dated, while Okami, the other game I used in the thumbnail, will still look amazing. And that's without me adding into the fact that The Last of Us 2 is a poorly written game with as much bloat as the Lord of Pestilence himself. But it's emblematic of every game that comes out in the mainstream now. They're all these uninteresting and corporately cookie cutter looking experiences. I'm not saying that every game has to be a watercolour looking masterpiece like Okami or entirely made of Play-Doh, but I'm saying I wish games tried with their visuals again. Yes, I can go to indie games to get my fix of stuff that is actually more interesting than looking at drywall, but that's not my point in this video. My point is, in this video, I feel like we need another renaissance like we had back in the day, and we need to make big companies try and take risks with their art styles instead of just playing it safe all the time. We need to get more mad genius savants getting budgets to put out their mad visions without them being corrupted and put through the meat grinder of the AAA games industry. Like a man dying of thirst in the desert, I require an oasis to sate me. Viva la revolution, brothers and sisters. I've been a goblin, and thank you for watching. If you would like to get all my videos early and to get your name in the credits, sign up to my Patreon like all these awesome people have. Links in the description.